He has delivered us from the domain of darkness and transferred us into the kingdom of his beloved Son, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins. You may be seated. For those of you, or us, who are newer to a church life that uses a liturgical calendar, you might be puzzled over what Christ the King Sunday is all about. Or if one is familiar, especially with the older liturgical calendar in practice, you might know that this feast or focus was not always something marked by a special day on the liturgical calendar. Even today, many of our fellow Anglicans in the ADLW, especially those who love the 1549 and the 1662 reforms especially, they will passionately be commemorating something else this morning, something else very valuable. It's called Stir Up Sunday, which is an informal tag from the collect for the day in the 1549 Book of Common Prayer, which begins, "Stir up, we beseech thee, O Lord, the will of your faithful people." Now, this was actually followed back in England with a tradition to stir up Christmas plum puddings, made on this day and matured and served at Christmas. And this pudding actually, and apparently, was preserved so well because it is rumored to have a very high alcohol content to prevent it from spoiling. And so we can offer our cheers to our fellow Anglicans on this day they celebrate so festively. But we today, along with many other Anglicans and many other Christian traditions worldwide, are celebrating what often goes by the name Feast of Christ the King, or Christ the King Sunday. This celebration is a more recent addition to liturgical calendars in Western Christian practice. Of course, the biblical and the theological theme of Jesus Christ as King of Kings and Lord of Lords is central to the Christian faith and worship. It's all over the hymns we sang today. It's all over the prayer book. Look at the Te Deum carefully. Christians from New Testament times stressed the royal office that Christ holds is central to his identity, to his dignity, and his work. It's central to our salvation. But before I look more deeply into the royalty of Christ and its importance for us Christians, I do want to talk about it being a more recent addition to the liturgical year. It was actually added to the church calendar just after the First World War. As many of you know, that war left a lot of the Western world in sheer devastation. That war also had split and divided Christian civilizations. With the utter chaos and despair that each of the devastated nations had undergone, especially those implicated in the war, with some 20 million people dying in the war and 20 million being injured, the nations were left desperate and demoralized. This was especially troubling because these wars happened between so-called Christian civilizations. People affected felt like Christianity, with its divisions and its out-of-touch forms, was simply too empty to address the despair and the healing of such destruction. Many of the governments were near economic collapse. There was high unemployment and very limited resources. Many were on the brink of starvation. As you know, there was a flood of anti-Christian modern ideologies that wanted to fill that void Christianity once filled. They arose to address the despair which traditional institutions seemed unable to address. Radical secularism, right? The emptying out of society from God was touted as the solution to the religious divisions within and between the nations. And it promised alternative political and social changes, challenging the monarchies and the church and all the other traditional institutions which they believed had become stagnant and outmoded, of an old world order, one we could never return to. They promised a new world order. Communism, scientism, fascism, consumerism, all competed to fill the space that was left when Christianity was no longer vibrant or in touch with its biblical and theological roots. The conditions were sadly ready-made for Benito Mussolini, Adolf Hitler, and Joseph Stalin to claim the despair and sell them a hopeful vision, all the while hiding the demonic source at the roots of each. Just after the First World War, Christians realized that secularism was on the march and ready to replace Christianity as the cultural center and heartbeat of their civilization. Pope Pius XI and other Christians realized that they could not be complacent nor take for granted the place of Christianity in post-war Europe. Pius himself issued an encyclical and established for the Church the Feast of Christ the King. Other concerned Christians and other liturgical traditions followed suit. The aim for the addition to the liturgical calendar with this focus was to stress the root and center of Christian faith itself and Christian culture and civilization, the kingship and lordship of Jesus Christ. At the heart of the gospel is the proclamation that he is king and sovereign, not only over the church, but over the political and economic realms as well. He is king over all, whether the world that is passing away has recognized it or not. And Christians are to center their faith and focus on Christ's kingship and rule over all things, so they will remain spiritually centered and rooted in truth and moral goodness. Here, the emphasis is Christ's rule over both creation and new creation, his rule over nations, political reality, social reality, even cultural reality. These are all arenas where his kingship needs to be remembered, proclaimed, and needs to make an impact. So this celebration, Christ the King Day, is a yearly time for Christians to consecrate their lives afresh to Christ's lordship and rule, focusing on how his kingdom and rule reigns in our hearts, minds, even our very bodies. Now, for anyone who knows where this strand of Western world history ends up, you know that Christians were especially going to need this focus for the trials that were going to come to them under Mussolini, Hitler, and Stalin. There are people in this very congregation who were around at the time. One can think, though, of the confessing church in Germany during the rise of Nazi ideology under Hitler. Concerned Christians noticed that this movement called the German Christian movement arose and embraced Nazism as the next wave of vibrant Christianity in Germany. They thought to be a good Christian was to be a good Nazi. Karl Barth, a Swiss by the way, and others were horrified by this and saw it as nothing but a blatant and idolatrous rejection of Christ's kingship. They actually got together various Christians to put together something that was called a new confession under these conditions. It went by the famous name, the Barmen Declaration. This was written by a group of Christian leaders in Germany to help Christians not lose focus, to not get absorbed by the temptations to join the so-called German Christians. Joining the German Christians meant life would be okay for you under Nazism. Withstanding or resisting meant it was not going to end well. But at its heart, the Barmen Declaration was an absolute commitment to Jesus Christ's kingship, being God's one and only true word whom we have to listen to and follow. Why? Because he is king. He is preeminent in all things. And our salvation is about his reign in over our life so we too can share in the inheritance of his kingdom and testify to his light in a world of darkness. I want to read just a little bit of that Barmen Declaration so you can see how this focus is at the heart. The Declaration insists, try the spirits whether they are of God. Prove also the words of the confessional synod of the German Evangelical Church to see whether they agree with Holy Scripture and with the confession of the Fathers. If you find that we are speaking contrary to the Scripture, then do not listen to us. But if you find